Michael Crichton lived from 1942 to 2008. He was best known as an author and filmmaker, as Carolyn mentioned, the creator of such works as Jurassic Park and the long-running television show ER. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard University. He received his MD from Harvard Medical School and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, where he did his research in public policy. He taught courses in anthropology at Cambridge and in writing at MIT. As we know, he was one of the most popular writers in the world. He sold over 200 million books. 13 have been made into films. He also wrote a few original screenplays for movies that he ended up directing himself. For example, Westworld, Coma, and The Great Train Robbery. So, quite the Renaissance man. Throughout his life, it was clear that there were two intertwined threads of interest. He had a strong interest in science and a strong interest in writing. His first bestseller, The Andromeda Strain, was published while he was still a medical student. His ability to integrate culturally relevant and topical scientific material into books and films while maintaining all the essential elements of an entertaining story accounted for much of their broad appeal. In Crichton's 2004 best-selling novel, State of Fear, which he refers to at the end of that video, he tackles the heated subject of global warming. And in the book, he acknowledged that the world was growing warmer, but he challenged the extreme anthropogenic warming scenarios. So this was the best example of Crichton integrating his concerns about real science within the context of a compelling story. And in preparation for this novel, he pored over hundreds of scientific articles and books and researched existing data on the subject of global warming for well over 3 years. And he didn't recommend anybody else do the same thing. Crichton showed this penchant for challenging and questioning established ideas as early as his days in Harvard Medical School. For example, he was struck by the refusal among professors at the time in medical school to discuss death and how to deal with patients who are dying, and also their refusal to explore the art of effectively relating to patients with diseases. And as we all know now, this is something that has been dealt with constructively for several decades since. So this questioning attitude and search for exacting standards in science and in writing would become a continual motif for the rest of Crichton's life. And what is not generally known to the public is that there was a deeper strata to Crichton's interests and thought. In a short while, I'll be summarizing the talk given by Crichton on environmentalism as religion, which he refers to in the first part of that video. This might lead some of us to believe that he was critical of religion or of religious systems of belief. He was, but he was not a materialist. He was open to the spiritual and the mystical, as well as dedicated to the scientific quest for knowledge of the world. So after medical school and writing a few bestsellers, he sort of had this Damascus moment where he was wondering what it was all about. I'm wealthy and successful and educated, but I'm not very happy. So he characterized his outlook at the age of 30 as follows, and I'll read a quote from his memoir. "What I knew was that the history of man demonstrated the inexorable triumph of reason over superstition, culminating in our acceptance of science as the best method for learning the truth and exploring the universe. That in the past, men had believed all sorts of nonsense, but through the fruits of science, we were able to roll back the darkness and live in the light of reason. I lived in a fast-paced scientific world where technical journals were removed from the library after 5 years. In general, I preferred to look forward. We lived in an exciting time in which we were learning the nature of reality at the subatomic level, the nature of the universe, and the nature of life. I was living in the most enlightened, the richest, the most advanced, the most liberated period in the history of man. And I knew that despite fame, fortune, and psychiatry bills, I was miserable." So it was then that Crichton was actually opened up to Eastern philosophy after stumbling upon a book by Ram Dass. And from there he went on to do some personal explorations into the dimensions of consciousness and subjective experiences that made him aware of other possible orders of meaning in existence. And he did this through various travels and journeys and meeting various people. But unlike the conventional New Agers of that decade, he approached the spiritual with the same scientific attitudes one adopts when exploring the natural world. So this became a third little-known thread of his life. He summarized these experiences, all of these experiences, very succinctly in his 1988 memoir, a book called Travels. On the subject of consciousness, which he studied and experienced quite a bit, he says the following, quote, "Consciousness has legitimate dimensions not yet guessed at. I suspect that in the future, studying the varieties of consciousness will have an increasingly practical importance in such areas as treating illness, maintaining health, and promoting creativity. As the practical value of altering consciousness becomes recognized, procedures to effect those alterations will become increasingly ordinary and unremarkable. The whole concept of changing states of consciousness will cease to have an exotic or threatening aspect." And then on the subject of psychic phenomena, which he looked into when he was making a film in the UK, he decided to go out and visit some London psychics, and he had a check-off list of things that he was going to do and say and not say, so that he could really vet out the phonies from the real ones. He comes to this conclusion at the end of his memoir. He says, quote, "At least some psychic phenomena are real. Psychic phenomena are generally categorized as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. I suspect that everybody has a degree of psychic ability, just as everyone has a degree of athletic or artistic ability. Some people have special gifts, other people have a particular interest that leads them to develop their abilities, but the phenomena itself is ordinary and widespread." And then lastly, on the subject of body energies, he says the following, quote, "There are energies associated with the human body that are not yet understood. Those energies can be felt and seen, and they are related to healing, sickness, and health. Although the existence of these body energies is formally accepted in some theoretical systems, such as those of Indian yogis and Chinese acupuncturists, they are not yet accepted in Western medicine. I suspect they will be in the near future. When that happens, medicine will recapture some traditional wisdom concerning the importance of bedside manner and hand-holding, what is now considered the art of medicine as opposed to the science." So, and as kind of an interesting footnote to this thread of Crichton's life, you might be interested to know that in 1987 he was invited to give a talk at Caltech to a group of scientists who all gathered regularly for the express purpose of debunking all the claims, any claims pertaining to the paranormal or altered states of consciousness or anything intuitive or metaphysical. In his prepared remarks, he jumped at the chance, of course, and in his prepared remarks he pointed out very strongly that the attitude of many scientists towards paranormal and the spiritual is short-sighted and closed-minded. This outlook is expressed most aptly in a statement by the renowned physicist Stephen Hawking, which Crichton quoted in his talk. Quote, "Mysticism is a cop-out," Hawking said. "If you find theoretical physicists and mathematics too hard, you turn to mysticism." So without going into the details of Crichton's talk, I will tell you that he does go on to quote. So
did Crichton agree with Hawking or disagree with him?
Disagreed. Yeah. So he goes on to quote Lao Tzu as giving one of a very chief and important perspective that all thinking men and women should acknowledge. Quote, and this is from Lao Tzu, "Existence is infinite, not to be defined." So Crichton took this to mean that human consciousness, as well as existence in general, is boundless, and that we should not get caught in all of the numerous categories and distinctions that we make for theoretical and academic reasons. He goes on to say that, quote, "We need the insights of the mystic every bit as much as we need the insights of the scientist. Mankind is diminished when either is missing," unquote. And then Crichton sums up his address to the Caltech scientists by quoting the following statement from Albert Einstein. Quote, "Humanity has every reason to place the proclaimers of high moral standards and values above the discoverers of objective truth. What humanity owes to personalities like Buddha, Moses, and Jesus ranks for me higher than all the achievements of the inquiring and constructive mind," unquote. The irony of that is that he never ended up giving that. He never ended up giving that speech. So now turning to the topic du jour, I'll summarize briefly the talk that a talk that Crichton gave in 2002 on environmentalism as religion. I'm sorry, 2003. And this will segue into Maurice's part of the discussion on public policy and how it's all related. So he was asked to give a talk to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco on what he believed to be the greatest challenge facing mankind. And he responded to that by saying the greatest challenge facing mankind was the challenge of distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. He noted that perceiving the truth has always been a challenge to mankind, but that in the information age, it takes on a special urgency and importance. Our struggle to determine what is true is in fact the struggle to decide which of our perceptions are genuine and which are false, and which ones are false because they're handed down or sold to us or generated by our hopes and fears. In Crichton's mind, he believed the environmental movement is an example of our failure to distinguish between scientific truth and fantasy, referring to it as one of the most powerful religions in the Western world. Environmentalism as a movement began well, he said, but in time became very unself-critical, relying more on beliefs than on scientific evidence. And this in turn generated bad public policy and spawned irrational fears among the public. And then he goes on to cite several examples of what he calls fallacious environmental claims. A couple of them he referred to in that video. One of them was the fear of overpopulation, which was pretty common throughout his lifetime. And I think I even remember hearing it a little bit growing up. Over the last, there were, population rates were going to skyrocket to 20 billion. And then as the decades went by, those predictions got lower and lower and lower. And now, I think the latest one...
Got higher and higher and higher.
What's that?
But the numbers got higher and higher and higher.
Exactly, right, but not quite as fast as was predicted. And
Well, the predictions were if you don't change. So the idea was the predictions caused a change.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
It's a dynamic system.
right, yeah, that's a good point. Another popular claim was that of mass starvation in America. Apparently this was very popular in the 60s and 70s. There was someone named Paul Ehrlich who predicted that 60 million Americans would die of starvation by the 1980s. And I guess he was quoted in articles and magazines and interviewed quite a bit. And certainly while poverty still exists, this prediction, which at the time was believed by many, was proven to be false. Another example he gives was related to the pesticide DDT. At the time, it was believed to be dangerous, and it needed to be banned, and it was banned. Crichton points out that DDT is not a carcinogen, does not cause birds to die, and should never have been banned. And he goes even further and claims that the banning of DDT actually led to the deaths of tens of millions of poor people throughout the globe. He also cited secondhand smoke as an example. He went into that a little bit in the video as another instance of fiction over fact. The studies performed by the EPA did not even meet their own criteria, but they still passed laws in California, which were later overturned by a federal judge.
The only claim about DDT is that it made the shells of the eggs of the birds thin. That was the only claim, and if that had been continued, certain birds would have gone extinct.
Yeah, I think his point was that because it was banned, it wasn't, the crops died and there were other effects.
It didn't kill birds, it's misleading. It didn't kill any birds. It made the eggshells thin so that when the parents sat on the egg was crushed.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading that too.
So it's misleading to say it didn't kill any birds. And anyway, just...
Keeping them honest.
There'll be time for...
I remember a lot of scare messages in relation to DDT packaging that contained DDT. I don't remember specifically what they were, but it was like, don't feed your children anything that's been contained in a package with DDT preservatives. So I do remember that.
I think we'll all have lots of comments, but let's have the speaker.
I think so,
have
too.
a say.
He went on to give several other examples. There were another popular claim was that the number of animal species around the globe would be cut in half by the year 2000. And of course that didn't come to pass. In closing his talk, Crichton emphasizes the need for a science of the environment that recognizes the complexity of nature, one that is rational, flexible, and apolitical in its application. And he warns against the mixing of real and important environmental concerns with what he calls the frantic fantasies that people have about one political party or another. He actually felt that the EPA was hopelessly politicized and that it was perhaps better that it be shut down. And he advocated for a new organization much closer to the FDA, which is ruthless about acquiring verifiable results and funding identical research projects to more than one group. I'll finish my portion by quoting his final remarks from that speech and then hand it over to Maurice, who will dive a little more deeply into how all of this relates to public policy. So this is how he ended the speech. Quote, "In the end, science offers us the only way out of politics. And if we allow science to become politicized, then we are lost. We will enter the internet version of the Dark Ages, an era of shifting fears and wild prejudices, transmitted to people who don't know any better. That's not a good future for the human race. That's our past. So it's time to abandon the religion of environmentalism and return to the science of environmentalism and base our public policy decisions firmly on that."
Now, would anyone have a specific question to what Ravi said? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the comment in that talk where he said we can't predict the weather next week, how can we predict the climate in 100 years? I mean, I hope people understand the fallacy of that logic. I mean, the way that the physics advanced with thermodynamics was to be able to recognize that you can't predict the movement of a particular particle, but you can predict the bulk behavior of a lot of particles. So yeah, you may not be able to predict the weather next week, but in fact predicting the climate 100 years from now is a lot easier. And again, just like Ehrlich and his predictions about population and starvation, it's a dynamic system, as somebody said back there, that by making the prediction, ideally we change our policies and then the prediction doesn't come true. That was the point of the prediction.
Yes.
What did he die of?
He died of a private battle with, I believe, some sort of throat cancer, and it just very suddenly. And he wasn't a smoker, not that I know of, at least.
Did he one of his family smokers?
I don't know.
But relatively young, in his 60s. Right?
Yeah, he was born in 1942.
He would have been.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And also, I'm not super clear, but just because he's an MD doesn't mean that he's a scientist. So he's making claims of maybe physicists or chemists and things like that, but maybe that's not, I don't know how well versed he is in all those different sciences to make environmental. I was just noticing that from the comment.
Well, if he went and did research with an institute like the Salk Institute,
Okay, yeah.
and training as an MD, he would at least have a high degree of expertise in things like biology and chemistry, because that's so physiology. He may know nothing about astrophysics or something.
Right, so I
Yeah.
just don't understand how the environment, though, can necessarily environmental changes. I mean,
Yeah.
you can expand, if you know how to do research, then you can do
Yeah.
research.
And it was a relatively new field. In a sense, nobody knew
Right.
environmental science in the 1960s to speak of. So sometimes that happens.
So, yeah, it was a lot.
You become part of a new movement. Yes, Jenny?
Curious about the idea of having an environmental science but not politics. So I'm wondering, take the example of one different part of science. But Albert Einstein knew what was coming out of the atom bomb research. He wrote a letter to FDR. There he was bridging what he knew deeply through science with what he knew was very relevant to the political situation. Do you happen to know what would have been Crichton's take on Einstein's action?
No. I think for Crichton, he seemed to be very adamant about the separation of, getting politics out of the research side of it. So everything leading up to the conclusions, not having it based on consensus or popular opinion, because either side of the political spectrum is going to have their own interests, and either consciously or subconsciously somehow that's going to filter down and contaminate the data. And that's why he felt strongly about the FDA model, although the FDA, he even says, the FDA is probably it's not a good three-letter word to bring up, but they, in terms of the way that they do their research, they were very deliberate and very very detailed about the process. Double-blind studies, I believe. So you had different groups doing the research, different groups applying testing the drugs, and then different groups analyzing the results, and none of them knew whether they were working with the control or with the actual, and none of them knew about each other. And supposedly in environmental science, there isn't this type of separation.
Well, I think this is part of what Maurice is going to address, this bridging. But I think what you're saying is that the science needs to be completely done scientifically. And then you can talk about political or practical applications.
Right.
It's not that there's not going to be any connection. It's just that you don't want political ideology, and we've just had a dramatic example this past week, interfering with the scientific process.
Yes, he was very adamant about that.
Yeah. Okay.
But who does the funding? I was just of the science.
How was he paid? That's a big picture.
But I was going to ask, wasn't he also trained as an anthropologist?
Mm-hmm.
So didn't he see more the big picture of everything? These minute details that we were talking about now?
Yeah, he did, I think, and that might be part of what shaped his approach to these matters, is his long-term view. Yeah, and he also made some comments about this notion of predicting the future and knowing what's going to happen 100 years from now with respect to science is difficult, because there are social elements that you can't factor in. 100 years ago, nobody thought we'd be burning fossil fuels and riding in cars and flying in planes. So, how do we know that 100 years from now that's going to be the case? So it's difficult in his mind to make those leaps.
One more comment, and then we'll move on. Dunson, you had one?
Yeah, I was quite struck when you mentioned that it's view of consciousness. That was interesting. That he recognized the importance of consciousness in all these studies, scientific and so on. So able to see, appreciate phenomena.
Yeah.
And real phenomena and also the importance of reason in all these, and also how that the recognition of consciousness, reason, and so on, being crucial also in understanding medicine in terms of health. I think some of the things you mentioned in the movie.
Right.
I mean, there were so many. These had ideas that sort of.
Yeah, it was a very interesting aspect of his life to me, and I was actually surprised that, when I started looking into him deeper, to realize that he'd kind of had this side to him, and that he was willing to explore different things, and he wasn't a materialist per se, in the sense that I think many scientists are they're closed off to things that can't be explained. He seemed to be open to them.
One last comment?
It's a question on Crichton as he started looking at the environmental movement, as we would say. Started talking about environmentalism, and most times isms have the problem that he was talking about. There's so many isms that have the heavy hand and kind of act as though they know what is everything, they know what is going on in the world and how people should behave.
Right.
And it's a hard line, generally speaking. But I wondered if he ever gave the environmental movement its due in terms of recognizing, aspects, just sort of saying, okay, I'm going to use my reason and I'm going to see this side of it and that side of it. Because obviously it's grown out of sort of a new pursuit of justice for the younger generation. That's what it is globally. And of course there are many brilliant people who've done good work and writers who have pointed things out about environmental degradation. So I'm just wondering, was he able to use his reason to see the positive side, aside from the ism, because there's so many people who fall prey to restricted visions of the world.
Yeah. To the environmental conclusions that were drawn about global warming, because he doesn't go all the way with it, I think he's often perceived as a contrarian or an outright denier. So that I think speaks to his his appreciation and taking into account people who have done the research and pursued the scientific method in the field of environmentalism. But I can actually read something from that, and then I think we should let Maurice take over. But he talks a little bit about his feelings about environmentalism and the environment in general. He says, I want it perfectly clear that I believe it is incumbent upon us to conduct our lives in a way that takes into account all the consequences of our actions, including the consequence to other people and the consequences to the environment. I believe it is important to act in ways that are sympathetic to the environment, and I believe this will always be a need, carrying into the future. I believe the world has genuine problems, and I believe it can and should be improved. But I also think that deciding what constitutes responsible action is immensely difficult, and the consequences of our actions are often difficult to know in advance.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're now going to hear from Maurice Bichef and his thinking about the bridge between science and public policy.